So my name is Evan Kirk. I'm a Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center. I'm here to present the North Carolina Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard with fiscal year 2021 data. We have a good mix of folks who have seen our dashboard before and folks who haven't, and I'll get into that in a second. So the objectives for the webinar today, we're going to learn a little bit about the Water and Wastewater Rate Survey. I'm going to go quickly into a little bit about the methodology and how you may have heard about us or heard from us during the process. I'm going to become familiar with a lot of the features of the North Carolina Water and Wastewater Rates Dashboard and how you can best use it for your community and to make financial decisions for your system. And then we're going to learn how to compare your rates with others. And I'll show you some tricks into how you can best do that, how you can best find your peers. We got some good questions in the registration. One of them was, how can I find peers that are most like my system when I'm doing this comparison? So I do have some questions that I can address from the registration at the beginning of the Q&A, and feel free to be putting your questions into the chat as the meeting goes on. I'd like to start by thanking our funder, the North Carolina Division of Water Infrastructure, and then also thank our partner, the North Carolina League of Municipalities. They've been influential in making sure this survey continues to happen every year. We've got about 15 years of data in North Carolina for water and wastewater rates, which is more than any other state in the country. And we're really grateful for their support and for their partnership in this effort. So as I mentioned, there's a mix of folks on this call who have seen the water and wastewater rates dashboard before and who use it potentially every year or have used it before. And then there are 24 folks who have never used it before. So welcome to the call. We will be going over both topics that will benefit users who have never used it before and users who use it every year. We do have 6 new dials on our dashboard that even users who have used the dashboard every single budget season may not know about, and I'll go into a little bit about what they mean and how you can best use them for your purposes. So a little bit about the data collection process and kind of how things work. So we take rate structures, we enter them into our database. We collect these rates by phone, by email, by fax from your website. So the best you can keep your websites up to date, the more easy this process is for us, but also the more you're able to share that information with the public and the more transparency you have with the public. So we do encourage people to keep their rates online, but we take the rates, we put them into the database, which allows us to calculate bills at pretty much any single consumption point that you can think of, down to the gallon. So we can do that calculation on the fly. We do have additional data sources. We get data from the US Census Bureau. We use the American Community Survey with the 5-year estimates. We use MHI, median household income, from that survey. We also get data from the United States Environmental Protection Agency Safe Drinking Water Information System, which we call SIDWIS. That gets us connections, number of population, estimation of population served. It also gets us some information about contacts, which in North Carolina, we've got such an extensive history of contact information that we don't necessarily need to use that. And then finally, we have a great partnership with the local government commission at the state treasurer office, and we get all your financial data from all the local government financial data from their really great data collection system. It's some of the most complete financial data that we get in any of the states that we do surveys, and that allows us to populate the number of dials that I'll go over in the dashboard, whereas in most states we just have 1 or 2 financial benchmarking dials, but in North Carolina we have I think 12. So it's really a wealth of information that we're able to get from them. So who was in the survey group this year? So we had 371 systems that are both water and wastewater. We have 89 systems that are water only and 24 systems that are wastewater only. And we have a good mix of systems by size. So we always do a good job of collecting the rate data for systems above 10,000 people. Typically, they're more likely to have their rates online. more likely to have full-time staff that we can contact to get the rates. A little bit more difficult to collect rates for systems under 1,000 people. 24% of the systems in this survey were below 1,000, but anyone who read the blog post that I put out a week or two ago, we had a slightly lower response rate this year because of COVID from systems in North Carolina, and the majority of the systems that didn't respond this year that did respond last year were systems that were below 1,000, so some smaller systems. So if you're on this call and you haven't sent your rates in, maybe you're playing with the dashboard later this afternoon and you find that your rates are not on the dashboard, or if you ever find that your rates are not right on the dashboard, email me directly. I'll get those rates updated as soon as possible, or we'll get you added as soon as possible. We're able to add you same day at this point. So I'm going to go over the anatomy of the dashboard. This section will primarily benefit folks who have never used a dashboard before, but it might be a good refresher for folks that have used the dashboard before. So I'll just start with the drop-down tab. You're able to use this to find your rate structure. If you're a utility that has multiple quote-unquote rate structures, you might see your name pop up more than once in this dropdown, and maybe followed by the rate structure name. And that rate structure name may not be something that you're familiar with. We may have given it a name on our own, but if you ask us, we can tell you kind of where we got that name for you. So you can begin typing in, and it'll guess what you're trying to type and fill out the rest. You can also find your dot on the map, which you'll see to the left here. And if you click on that, then that will bring you to your rate structure as well. Unfortunately, because of the more dials on our dashboard, the map is a little bit smaller this year. But certainly, if you're out in a rural area, you should be able to find your dot pretty easily. But if you're in a more congested area in an urban area, it might not be really easy to click on your dot. This section here allows you to select what service you're looking at, and allows you to vary the consumption point at which you're looking. So the default in North Carolina is 5,000 gallons per month. And then it also tells you what the monthly bill is. So you can select water, you can select sewer, water and sewer combined. If you're only a water or only a sewer utility, then it'll gray out the other option, and it won't let you select the combined. And then the dials to the right, they automatically update based off of the service that you've selected. This section here is the map that I mentioned. We'll get a little bit more into the comparison group that you'll also see on this map. And then a little bit later, I'll talk about the effects of raising the rates at the bottom. But this just shows all the systems that are in the state based off of the selection that we selected above. So right now it's showing all of the systems that have water. If you select sewer bill, it'll show all of the systems that have sewer. If you select water and sewer, it'll show all of the systems that have water and sewer. The next section are the dials. I'll get into each one of the dials on a more individual basis in a minute. This is a section that's dynamic based off of the consumption point that you select. So the bill comparison will change based off of the consumption point that you select, and so will the median affordability. But the cost recovery, the conservation signal, and the non-revenue water and wastewater inefficiency, those all stay the same based off of the consumption point. The next section is the comparison group. So this allows you to compare to peers. Historically, and this is the kind of the inspiration of the dashboard going back a number of years, systems would just select the regional systems. So if they're going to their council to try to get a rate increase, or the council is trying to keep perhaps rates artificially low, they might be looking at your neighbors, and your neighbors might have a completely different situation than you. So you may be a surface water system that has a high level of treatment required to get your drinking water up to standard, and maybe all your neighbors are on groundwater. Maybe you've got a lot of distance between connections. Maybe you're more of a rural system with a little bit of sprawl. Maybe you've got a higher infrastructure cost per connection. So maybe your rates are higher than your peers in the immediate vicinity. it would be misleading and it would be doing a disservice to compare your rates to your immediate neighbors because of that situation. So instead, we've developed comparison groups, which allow you to compare to systems that are more like your own. So what are the comparison groups we have? So we have size. A system that's less than 10,000 people will have higher cost per connection for infrastructure than a system that's greater than 10,000 people on average. So you want to compare it to systems that are in your size range. So if you go to the comparison group and you select systems of a similar size, it'll tell you on the dashboard what size your system falls into, and then it'll be showing you all the systems that fall into that size. If you want to compare based off of rate structure, if let's say you have a uniform rate, which means the cost per gallon of water that you're charging to your customer doesn't vary based off of consumption, then you're going to be comparing to other uniform rates in the state. If you want to compare based off a location, you can select, I believe it's 10, 25, 50 miles from your utility. That's the one that is the historical comparison. So basically, that's probably one that you necessarily don't want to use on its own. You can use it as part of a suite of other comparisons, but you don't want to be using that one on its own. Similar demographics, similar type, and by type we mean both utility type. So are you a municipality? Are you an authority? Are you a county? And also what type of source of water you have. So are you surface water? Are you mixed, which kind of defaults you back to surface water? And then are you groundwater, or are you purchased water? And then similar financial situation. So I'll start with the bill comparison dial, and anyone who's not colorblind like myself, I can tell that there are different colors, but they have consulted with me on these colors for other colorblind people to be able to see. But you might have seen that there's a number of colors, and it's very nice and colorful, and I'll get a little bit into what those colors mean and why they're important. And then how we kind of carefully selected them to be to show what we want to show. So the bill comparison dial, this is a dynamic dial that's comparing to your peers based off of the comparison group that you selected. So if you selected systems of similar size, it's only showing the systems that fall in that comparison group in the dial. So it's showing you the minimum bill at that consumption point in your comparison group, and then the maximum bill, and then it's showing the quintiles as well. So the green section of this dial shows the middle 50%. So half of utilities in your peer group have bills in this range. So moving on to the next part of this dial, the yellow has half of 15% fall in each one of these ranges. So 15% have a bill below the 50%, but above the last, I believe it's 10% here. And then 15% have a bill above the 50%, but below or above, sorry, the next 10%. So essentially in each of the yellow, add them both together, that's 30% of the bills that fall within those light green bands. I said yellow, but it clearly says light green in front of me. And then the majority of bills fall within both shades of green. So in both the light green and the I guess normal green, the majority, 80% of the bills fall within that range. And then we have 10% of the bills that are lower than the light green at the lower end and higher than the light green at the higher end. And these are in the yellow band. And we have it as yellow, and this is where we carefully chose these colors because it does not necessarily mean that their bills are bad at that level. They may have very low bills, but they may be covering all their costs and planning for capital improvements into the future. Their bill may be high, but they may have a very valid reason for having a high bill, and maybe their customers can afford that high bill. So that doesn't necessarily mean that their bills are wrong if they're high. So we're not trying to infer that bills are wrong based off of the color range that they fall into. We're just simply giving this as the ability for you to compare to your peer group. So the next I'll go into the conservation signal. So these color bands are quartiles, meaning 25% of the bills fall within each one of these ranges. And it's actually the marginal rate of water for the next 1,000 gallons at 10,000 gallons. So after a customer is using 10,000 gallons per month, how much money does the next 1,000 gallons cost to get them to 11,000 gallons of consumption? So I've got a chat. Can we get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. I'm going to be posting them on the website, and I'll email all the registrants with the slides after the webinar. And I'm also going to be posting a recording on the website as well. And as you're playing along, as you're following along, Shadi did put a link to the dashboard in the chat, so you can mess around with the dashboard as I'm talking. And please follow that link if you'd like. So the conservation signal, again, we selected these color bands to be meaningful, but not to insinuate anything. So we don't have any reds on this dial. So we don't want to infer that having a conservation signal below $4 or below $2 is bad. We don't want to infer that having one above $6 or anywhere around that is bad. But you can see that in this comparison group, the max is $10, meaning between 10 and 11,000 gallons, that the max utility is charging $10,000, or sorry, $10 per 1,000 gallons. Now the conservation signal is important because it's telling the utility and what signal are you sending to the customer at a high rate of usage to reduce consumption, or are you sending one at all? So if your utility is in a situation where you're nearing potentially max capacity of your water source, of your reservoir or well, maybe you're experiencing population growth and you want to avoid having to increase the capacity of your system to service your customers with more water into the future, because it would be expensive to create that infrastructure. It'd be expensive to perhaps create a new wastewater treatment or water treatment plant, or to develop a new reservoir, or to purchase water from another system to cover your needs. What signal are you sending to your customers to reduce usage once they've already hit a high usage? So we picked 10,000 gallons because that's well above what even a household of 4 would be using at normal non-discretionary water usage. We know that for 95, 98% of households, that 10,000 gallons and above, all the water that falls in that usage is going to be discretionary water usage that a price signal to that customer may encourage them to reduce their usage. So that's what the conservation signal is useful for. So if one of your core principles, if one of your goals as a utility is to minimize perhaps wasteful water usage, or minimize the increased demand of your customers across the board, then perhaps you want your conservation signal to be a little bit higher. If you're a system that maybe is experiencing a decline in customers over time, or you're trying to encourage business development or economic development, maybe you're okay with a conservation signal that's a little bit lower, or maybe you're okay ignoring the conservation signal altogether. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about benchmarks that are specific to your utility and that you're not actually comparing to other utilities at this point. So the cost recovery dial, again, this is about the utility itself, and it's not comparing to any other utilities. So the cost recovery, including depreciation, is the operating revenues divided by the operating expenses. And those operating expenses include depreciation as a line item. We want this to be above 1 at a minimum, and we want it to be above 1.2 as a goal. So anyone in the red may be in a situation where they need to perhaps look at either reducing costs in the future or increasing rates to increase revenues. But certainly, if you fall in the red on this dial, you want to take a closer look at your financials to see where you stand. The yellow indicates that perhaps revenues are sufficient to cover costs, but you may have a problem in the future at covering future infrastructure needs. So depreciation is an accounting way of determining the decrease in value of your assets over time, and it's a somewhat decent way of looking at how much money you need to reinvest in your system in order to get you back to square one. So if you spend $1 million in infrastructure in year one, and then 20 years later, that all that infrastructure should have been depreciated. Theoretically, based off of that calculation, you would need $1 million to replace that infrastructure, but we all know that's not true. We know that you would probably need more than $1 million because of inflation. So that's why we have a goal of 1.2 to cover that inflation. In the future, it's going to be more expensive to replace the infrastructure that you put in today than it was for you to put it in today. So that's why the goal for the cost recovery dial is 1.2 or higher. So utilities in the green are less likely to have challenges in paying for their day-to-day costs and certainly for their long-term goals, but it's not guaranteed that if you fall in this green that you're still going to meet all your goals. So you still want to, at this point, probably have a capital improvement plan in place and know that you've got a plan in place to fund future infrastructure needs. Sorry. Okay. Revenues above 2.8 may be too good, quote unquote. And it just may be that, sorry, local governments don't necessarily like utilities to be charging way too much for revenue for services if they're not investing that money back in their system, or if they're not, they don't have a plan for that money in the future. So very rare that a system falls in that too good category. So it's not something that we necessarily need to dwell on too much. The next dial that I'll talk about is the median affordability dial. So again, the median household income we get from the American Community Survey, and we're comparing the annual cost of water at a certain consumption point of either water or water and wastewater bills. You divide that by the median household income to get the percentage of household income spent on water, the percentage of the median household income spent on water. So EPA has a metric which there's a blog that I wrote a few weeks ago about affordability metrics that I can, Shadi's listening, he might be able to post it in the chat, but I can certainly post it in the chat towards the end of the webinar that talks about kind of where we got this metric from in the first place. So in the past, the goal has been 2% of the median household income, but we know now that it's not quite so binary. So we kind of didn't have it to be at 2%, over 2% bad, under 2% good. So we've got kind of a gradient of darker and darker colors as the bill gets higher and higher as a percentage of median household income. If you're falling in some of those darker shades as a utility, then you may want to be looking at ways that you can perhaps have a customer assistance program, or ways in which maybe you can incentivize efficiency of fixtures, other ways to encourage customers to perhaps reduce their bill to make it more affordable. But this is just one metric that you could use along with others to see kind of where your water and wastewater bill sits. We found too that a good way as affordability is to look at other costs in your community. So if your water bill is particularly high, but other costs are low, maybe you're still okay. If your water bill is low, but your other costs are high, maybe you still want to think about a customer assistance program. Just kind of, there's a lot of things that can be taken in context here. So, and I'll get that blog to you all. It's a good blog to think about where this metric came from and what some other metrics are that you can use to analyze your bills. So another thing about the dashboard is that you can click on the question marks that are surrounded by a blue sort of circle. And that'll give you a pop-up window, which tells you a lot more about the metric, and then goes over how it's calculated. It actually also shows your specific data in there. So I've been picking on Apex all day. I apologize if there's anyone from Apex on the call, but this does go over what your annual bill is, what your specific annual bill is. So this is Apex's annual bill, and then what the annual MHI is in that community. So it'll show you what your actual data is, so you don't have to go and look for that yourself. It'll do that for all the dials that have data from your utility in there. A couple of new metrics that appear on the front page are non-revenue water and wastewater inefficiency. So non-revenue water is just kind of put very plainly is water that goes through your water treatment plant but does not get billed for. And there are multiple reasons why that can occur. So you can experience losses from leaks. You can experience losses from breaks in water mains, but you can also experience losses from inefficiency in aging meters. You can also experience losses from other things that aren't metered, other water uses that aren't metered, perhaps street cleaning, perhaps you have a customer or a local government entity that doesn't pay for water or pays a reduced rate for water. Those are all examples of non-revenue water, and you can see the calculation here. I won't go over the calculation verbally. And again, your raw data will show up in this question mark box when you click on it, so you can see what the data is that we have for you. This data comes from the local government commission. So again, this is a good example of the excellent data they collect, what we are able to do with it. So if you see that your non-revenue water is approaching the red, certainly you don't want to have 100% of your water be non-revenue water. Obviously, the lower the better, but there may be reasons why water is non-revenue water that you know about, or you may have already recognized through an asset management plan or a capital improvement plan that there are areas in which you're losing water that may not yet be cost effective to replace. So just you want to, as that gets higher, you want to take a look at perhaps why you're experiencing high levels of non-revenue water. Wastewater inefficiency, it's water that it's the wastewater volume delivered to the wastewater treatment plant minus the wastewater volume billed to customers. So this accounts for inflow and infiltration into the wastewater system. Essentially, you don't want to be treating a bunch of groundwater that's coming into aging collection system because perhaps that would increase the number of sanitary sewer overflows that you have, but it's also going to increase your energy costs. And it may even affect the capacity of your MPDES permit. So if you have a lot of inflow and infiltration, you may be not be able to experience the development that you may otherwise want if you're being constrained by a permit that's reducing your outflow volumes. So why do some indicators state data not available? So that's an excellent question, John. It's just we're not able to get the data for your system. So if your system had not reported non-revenue water or wastewater inefficiency to the LGC, then we don't have that data for you. Unfortunately, we can't show it if we don't have it. We could look into doing those calculations for you. So if you do have that data elsewhere, we can definitely help you do those calculations for you. Drew asks, for the cost recovery dial, you mentioned that yellow mean revenues are sufficient, but could be problematic long-term. What does long-term mean in this context? That's up for interpretation. So I'll go back quickly to the revenue dial, the cost recovery dial rather. So he asked, what does potential insufficiency of revenue mean in the long term? And that just means that in the next 5-10 years, your system may be experiencing depreciation that you're not accounting for. Your assets, you may have to replace more assets than that you've saved up for. So if 1.17 times your expenses if your revenues are 1.17 times your expenses, maybe in order to replace your assets in the future, it was actually 1.2, then long-term will sneak up on you, but it won't sneak up on you this year. So maybe in 5 years, you won't have the cash on hand to pay as you go to replace infrastructure. Maybe you'll have to borrow money instead, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But maybe if you had otherwise had your rates sufficient to cover your costs, and save for depreciation, you might have been able to pay with cash and save on interest. So that's just an example. Long-term's up for interpretation. Non-revenue water is included in the local water supply plan updates to DEQ. Thank you, Vicky. John, if you wanted to contact me, we can try to find your non-revenue water data from your local water supply plan. And we can do those calculations for you. And we can see about getting that data in the dashboard so you can show it to your stakeholders. Okay, so I've gone over both of the new dials on the front page. Wanted to point out the financial benchmarks tab. There's a ton of stuff on the financial benchmarks tab. And to point you to some information about what these dials mean, beyond the operating revenue divided by operating expenses, then there's a YouTube video that I'll show you in a second here, and that will allow you to see what the benchmarks mean in the with a metaphor of a man with a car. So they go over kind of what the debt service coverage ratio might mean to the man with the car, what the quick ratio means, and how that man is saving not only to replace his car when it breaks down, but also to save for maintenance on the car and insurance and all that type of stuff. So that'll help explain all the dials that aren't the new dials at the bottom. So now I'll go into the new dials at the bottom. So we have 2 dials that represent cash flow. The first is receivables ratio. So on your audited financial statement, you have in your assets, you have receivables, and these are basically outstanding bills on your water and or wastewater bills. And we want that value to the total outstanding receivables at the end of the fiscal year to be less, to be about 1 when you divide it by your billing period. So the days in receivables that are outstanding divided by your billing period, we want it to be about 1, meaning you're collecting your bills about as often as they go out. So you don't have a lot of bills that stay outstanding longer than the billing period. So this just tells you how good your system is at collecting bills, and perhaps how well your customers are paying their bills on time. Cash flow from operating activities. We're looking at essentially once you've paid all of your operation expenses, and excluding depreciation, once you've accounted for your changes in receivables, and once you've also accounted for the changes in your cash balances, how much money do you have left over, which would be able to pay for other things like capital expenses and debt service expenses. We want this to be certainly positive, and this dial looks at your peers. So we're looking at systems that are about the same size as you. So you can see for this system here, this example system, we're only looking at systems between 1 and 3,000 accounts, because these are systems that are more likely to have a cash flow from operating activities like yours. And then it tells you the number of utilities in that comparison group. There's 115 in this one. And it actually tells you your utilities cash flow from operating expenses, operating activities.
Evan, I'm sorry, do you mind going back to the receivables ratio? I got one more thing to add to that. Thank you. Hi everybody, this is Shadi Askaf with the Environmental Finance Center. Just wanted to let you know, in case you've been hearing a little bit more about receivables from the Local Government Commission or from the Viable Utilities Program or something else, just letting you know that there are 2 things that the Local Government Commission is looking for with receivables. What we're showing here is what we can show you from 1 year's worth of audited statements, which is what was that ratio in the past fiscal year, and you know, how well did you do on collections in that fiscal year. But also in addition to that, the local government commission and Division of Water Infrastructure is looking at your trends over time. And that we can't show you because we're only showing you the last fiscal year. And what they're looking for is your receivables ratio increasing over time, which means that it's the amount of time it takes for you to collect on bills is getting longer and longer. And if it's increasing over time by small fractions, relatively consistently, that will raise a flag as well. So there's two things to look for. One is just how well are you doing with collections? And it's going to be really hard to get a 1.0. I think anywhere between 1 and 1.5 would be pretty good. And I think the state is really concerned about anything above 2 being that ratio. And then also track and see how that ratio is looking over time. And if you're seeing an increase in that ratio, then that's another problematic one, which we can't show you on the dashboard. But thank you. That's all I want to add to that.
Perfect. Okay. The next two have to do with capital outlays. So average annual recent capital outlay. We're looking at average annual capital outlay relative to assets. And this is over the last 5 years. So we're averaging out between, in this case, for this dashboard, 2016 to 2020. Again, you can see your utilities data. You can see your total depreciable assets, which is essentially your infrastructure. And we're looking to see the ratio be, the percentage be a little bit higher. Certainly for, if there's an asset that you need to replace every 5 years, then your goal will be 20%, but not all your assets you're replacing every 5 years. A lot of your assets have a much longer lifetime. So we're just looking for that certainly to be kind of in the middle of this dial here. So the higher the better, but certainly we don't expect anyone to be in the 15 to 20% range unless they've done a massive overhaul in the last 5 years. So maybe a new treatment plant would certainly put you very high on this dial. And then we're also looking at the average annual capital outlay relative to operating revenues. So we want to make sure that in the last 5 years that you've consistently been spending a decent percentage of your operating revenues on capital outlays. That way you're not falling behind on your capital improvement, so you're not going to experience rate shock into the future. So again, you can see your utilities actual data, and then you can see what your operating revenues were for fiscal year 2020. So even though the data, the average capital outlay is based off of the last 5 years of data, this year the operating revenues are for 2020. So we're not basing off of your average operating revenues over the last 5 years. It's just this year. So this kind of will tell your stakeholders, will tell your council how well you've been doing over the last 5 years of paying for capital improvements or capital outlays. Certainly you don't want to be at zero. You want to make sure that you're doing some sort of capital improvement unless you're a brand new utility. You want to make sure that every single year you're biting off a little bit. That way at the end, or there's no end, but that way you don't experience 10 years down the road that you need to do 10 years worth of capital improvements. Again, on this page, you can click on any of the question marks and up pops these boxes that has your data, that has the calculation and has a nice description. If you have any further questions beyond that, feel free to ask us. Here is the video that goes over financial benchmarking and talks a lot about a lot of these ratios. I'm going to quickly do a Google search for it. I should have had the file up, but and I'll post in the chat. So financial benchmarking. Here it is. So this is a great video for you all to watch on your own time, and that'll allow you to learn a bit more about the benchmarks that are on our financial benchmarking tab. Again, we also have another tab, the characteristics tab. This goes over a lot of the data that I talked about from other sources. So I mentioned census, I mentioned the Safe Drinking Water Information System. It goes over a little bit about your LGC data. Certainly the financial benchmarks tab is a lot more comprehensive, but this has operating revenues, expenses, and assets. And then it goes over the median value for all these numbers based off of the comparison group that you select on this tab. So you can select all utilities and you can select all the other comparison groups that I had already mentioned leading up to this point. And then we have a links tab, which has a lot of excellent resources that you might be able to use to further your financial sustainability. So we've got tables of rates. We've got a report that analyzes rates across the whole state. We've got other resources. Division of Water Infrastructure's website is here. LGC's website is here. We've got a bunch of tools. If there's a need that you have identified, then you could message us. You could email me, email Shadi, and we can point you to perhaps resources that might best suit your needs, because maybe you don't even know what to look for. If that's the case, then tell us a little bit about your situation, and we'll try to point you to the right resource. I did mention that I'd go talk a little bit about the effects of raising rates tab. So that will blur out a lot of the dials, but it'll also change the cost recovery. And this is a very back of the envelope type calculation. So we're assuming that for every 10% increase in price, that there's a corresponding 3% decrease in consumption, and it'll tell you that, and it'll give a disclaimer like this is a kind of a very back of the envelope calculation, and you should use it with caution, but it can give you a little bit of idea of what raising your rates might do for your cost recovery and for your median affordability. So use that how you see fit. And then also the download data button at the bottom will give you all the utilities that are in your currently selected comparison group. So one of the questions that gentleman from the town of Mebane, or the city of Mebane, sent was, how can I best find cities that are most like my own to compare to? If you select some of the comparison groups, you can see what cities fall into those comparison groups. So if Mebane decides to go and select cities of similar population or utilities of similar population, service population, then they might be able to find that, hey, Lowell is a lot like us, or city B is a lot like us, and then maybe they can go a little bit more in depth into Lowell's situation to compare. So you can look at other utilities on the dashboard as well to help conceptualize your situation. So when to use this tool, I mentioned that about a third of the people on the webinar or who register for the webinar use this tool every budgeting season. So obviously it's useful to use for your annual rate review. You may not be raising your rates every year. Maybe you're raising your rates every other year or every third year, but you should make sure that you're taking into account trends, and you're also, if you are not covering your costs currently, including depreciation, maybe you want to make sure that there's a reason for that, or if there's not a reason for that, then maybe it's time to go in and reevaluate your rates. And then you can use your benchmarks and use your comparison groups to compare it to other utilities. So you can also use it when you're presenting to your board. So showing your board where your utility sits and showing them maybe you're a utility that has an operating ratio below 1, including depreciation. Show them that you're in the red and that something needs to be done, or you might be experiencing some rate shock in the future, or maybe you're going to be experiencing a lower level of service and maybe even some violations that might cost your utility some money. You can also use the dashboard to explain rates to your customers. So if maybe you've got consistently customers who are complaining about high rates, you can show them that, hey, we're charging high rates for a reason. Here's all of our financial benchmarks, and we're in the healthy zone, but we can't lower our rates. Otherwise, we'll fall into the yellow or the red. And we're also not price gouging you. Look at all these utilities that are like us that charge more than us, or look at all these utilities that charge less than us but aren't covering their costs. And then for private systems, this is less likely, but you might be able to use it as a part of your North Carolina Utility Commission rate case. And again, here's an example. This is an older example, but this is a utility that did use the dial, the cost recovery dial, to show, hey, we're in the red. We're 0.76 operating ratio, including depreciation. We need to stop this operating loss and raise our rates into the future. So we have additional resources I already mentioned. We have standardized rate information. Basically, it's your rate sheet, but in a Tableau format. Tableau is a data visualization software. It'll show you your base charge and your volumetric charge and all sorts of other things. We have a table of other rate structures. So if you want an Excel table that actually shows you that you can data crunch on your own, feel free to download that. We have a summary report which goes over statewide trends. You can find all those links at this link here. And I will copy that and send it to you all in the chat. Okay. Nicole asks, how do rates relate to amount of grants you get? That's a relatively complicated question. Certainly, the North Carolina Division of Water Infrastructure, when they're determining if you're eligible for principal forgiveness in the state revolving fund loan program, high rates are one of the factors that go into deciding whether or not you're eligible for principal forgiveness. I don't know the details about other grants that are out there, but certainly if you can show a grant program that you're already have high rates and you're doing everything you can, and you're experiencing an affordability challenge, that may just increase your likelihood of getting the grant. I would encourage you to use the dashboard as you see fit in any grant application process. We're excited about this. So we've got a way that you can update the rates on your own, and you can go to this website. The link is here, and I'll post it in the chat, and register for an account, and then we'll approve you and make sure that you're actually affiliated with the utility that you say you're affiliated with. We've got a step-by-step description of how you can get involved with this, and it'll basically allow you to go in and update the utility rate structure on your own. So let's say after you go to the board and council votes on a new budget, and part of that new budget is a rate increase, then you can go in and edit your rates to show that you have a rate increase. Then you would also submit to us your rate sheet, and then we can determine that what you entered is correct, and then approve it, and it'll be updated on the dashboard automatically. So this is part of a grant that we have that is basically trying to increase the transparency of data and increase the data sharing. So certainly we encourage you to participate in this. And again, you can find all the information that you need on that page. So that's all I have today. I can go over the Q&A. Again, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. Natalie posted an affordability calculator for that DEQ has under additional resources. So high rates certainly will increase your affordability ratio, your median household income indicator, and that might be one of the criteria in a grant process. I don't think that we've missed any questions, so feel free to post your questions in the chat. I do have a couple more questions that came in the registration that I can go over here. So how do we use our dashboard to see if our rates are competitive? So that one I want to tiptoe around a little bit because I want to make sure that to the best extent that you can, that you're not looking at rate setting as necessarily a competition with your peers. But the bill comparison dial is the best way to compare your rates to quote unquote the competition, maybe your neighbors. But I would advise people that as you're looking at the dashboard, that you are using the comparison group to make sure that you're looking at utilities that are more like you. So I mentioned that you can look at the similar number of accounts, which is essentially the population, and that will change the dial. It changes the comparison group, so it changes the people that you're compared to. And then it'll also tell you, now you're comparing to systems between 3 and 10,000 accounts for Aberdeen. And then you could also change, if you want to look at the water bill only, if you want to look at the sewer bill only, or the water and sewer bill, all the dials will update accordingly except for the cost recovery dial. And now you can look at utilities that are even more like you. So a utility that's just a water utility is not as much like you as a utility that's serving both water and wastewater, if that's what you do. So that would be how you would compare to your peers to see if you're competitive. But again, you don't want to be competitive at the expense of not covering your costs. So again, I'm sorry, picking on Aberdeen. They are covering their costs. They fall in that yellow category, 1.1. So they may want to evaluate whether or not they're saving for future capital improvement needs. But their affordability looks pretty good, and their bill is relatively low compared to their peers. So they may have some room to increase their rates into the future if they need to cover their costs. So how can we shift elected officials' view of comparing our systems to our neighbors to charging rates necessary for our entity? So that's an excellent question. And I looked at the gentleman who submitted this question, and he represents a system that is doing pretty well. So their benchmarking looks healthy. So what I would say is that direct them to the dials that don't compare yourself against other systems. So if you're trying to direct your elected officials to look at what you need to cover your costs, then look at the financial benchmarking tab and don't even show them the tab compared to the other entities. So if you're showing them that, hey, we're not covering our operating expenses with depreciation not even included, maybe you're in the red for this dial, then you know that's look elected officials, red, bad. You know, we need to potentially raise our rates a little bit to cover those costs. So I think the main point of that would be direct them to the dials that don't include comparisons to other utilities. So is there an industry standard for frequency of rate adjustments? There is not. Typically, we recommend that utilities are at least reviewing their rates every year. So every single year, even if you don't adjust your rates, even if you don't go in and ask for a rate increase to council, that you're at least making sure that your rates are at a point where you're covering all your costs and saving a little bit for capital improvement. While there's no standard, I would say that it's best practices to review your rates every year and to adjust your rates accordingly. So we've got 7 minutes left. Looks like Shadi unmuted. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, I've got follow up on the question about how do you get the boards to kind of look past the rates comparison. In addition to the dashboard, there are other resources and guidance that we provide and some trainings. One thing that we're developing right now, and it's in preliminary draft form, hopefully we finalize it soon, is a one-page, essentially it's like a cheat sheet for board members to ask questions about utility viability. So it's a sheet that you can send to your board members, and then they can use that to ask those questions to find out more about your utility viability. And none of those questions ask, how do our rates compare to our neighboring rates? The questions are a little more about, you know, what do you have in reserves? What do you have for capital planning? So other kinds of more holistic look at utility viability. And that way we're hoping that elected officials who, you know, may not have a lot of experience with utility finance can use this and ask the right questions, or at least get started on the right questions, and move away from the idea that low rates is the goal here, and a little bit more about making sure that your enterprise fund is financially viable in the long term. So once that document is finalized, we'll be posting it and kind of sharing that on NC Water listserv and other avenues as well. But if you don't see it and you're interested in that, feel free to send me or Evan an email, and we'll make sure to share that document with you. But it's specifically for them to ask about utility viability.
Exactly. Thank you. That's an excellent point. So in your experience, which indicators are the ones we need to pay more attention? So we kind of have them strategically laid out such that the ones that appear on the first page, we deem to be the ones that maybe if you have a limited amount of time to devote to it, or you just want to get the point across real quickly. I'd say the first and foremost is the cost recovery dial, including depreciation. If you only have time to devote to one dial, this is probably the one to devote time to. And then that will allow you to see if you're covering your costs today and saving for the future. And then at that point, I think we're just kind of we're just picking hairs about what's the most important after that. But it depends on what's more important to you after that. So feel free to watch that YouTube video that I sent. It's only about 10 minutes long. And that will give you an idea of maybe some other metrics that you might be able to use if you want to keep the number of dials lower. But in other states where we only have one or two financial benchmarking dials, the one that we always have is the cost recovery, including depreciation. So excellent question, Eric. I believe I had one more question from registration that I can try to pull up here.
While you're doing that, Evan, just kind of follow up on the question about industry standards for rate adjustments. Definitely having an annual review of your rates is important, and not just for your staff. I think that the staff should definitely be looking at the water and sewer rates every year, just to make sure whether or not you need to propose a rate increase or not. But it's also really important for your elected officials to take a look at that as well. So even if it's not on their agenda, get it on the agenda. They need to have at least once a year review of the rates, even if you are not really anticipating the rate increase, just so that they know that you've done the analysis and that that everything looks fine. But it's part of the state's master plan to make sure that all local governments are on a viable pathway. So there are some things that utilities need to do on the infrastructure side, on the management side. I forgot the third one. I think is operations. But one of those things is to make sure that the elected officials are aware of and thinking about rate increases, or just even having the review of the rate. So at least once a year for the elected officials too, not just the staff.
Great point. I will use this time. I don't have any more questions from registration, so we have 2 minutes left. Feel free to drop it in the chat if you have another question. And even if you don't think we'll have time to answer it, we can follow up. I will just kind of talk a little bit about the data download. It's going to pull up another web page, and it'll show you your bill information at 500-gallon intervals. It'll show you a lot of your demographic data. It'll show you a little bit about your utility, and then it'll also show you all the utilities in your comparison group. So if you remember, I had selected similar number of accounts. So these are all the utilities that fall in that similar number of accounts. So the gentleman from Mebane that asked a question about how do I find a utility that's like mine, for Aberdeen, they might look at any of the utilities that fall in this comparison group. So they might look at Kings Mountain, they might look at Brevard, and they could just narrow it down from there if they wanted to select 5 or 10 utilities that are like theirs. Again, you want to make sure too that maybe that those utilities also fall into like a similar customer income, or they also fall into I think same water source type would be a good one. That'll tell you all utilities for Aberdeen that are getting their water from a groundwater system. And then it also has a lot of your comparison group data for the financial benchmarks that were on the financial benchmark tab, and also has your data there too up here. So if you want to get a report of where your utility stands, this is a good way to get it, and then certainly edit it how you see fit, but this will give you a comprehensive summary of where everything stands. But when you're showing things to folks who don't work in water and wastewater daily like you do, I would use the dials and use the colors, because it allows them to see visually kind of where things sit and how things are benchmarked. So with that, we're at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.